Everyone, welcome back. Today I want to take a look at World War One and its social effects and how it changed art and culture. And so some of the ideas that were introduced during the 19th century seem to be validated by World War One. The ideas of Darwin that humans are more animal-like and barbaric, and life as a struggle for existence comes to life and really is animated in World War One. World War One proves that humans are mainly animals that are not much more than that, as they struggle for their own selfish means and their own survival. It confirms the ideas of Karl Marx that people are struggling for resources, that nations were competing against nations in order to have supremacy, that politicians embark on campaigns not for the safety of their people or the security of their country, but for their own personal gain. And it confirms the ideas that Nietzsche, that we seem to be lost and no longer seeking assistance from a divine entity. Perhaps humans are governing our own behavior, and life is merely a series of random events that have no overarching meaning or purpose, or at least that's how people felt in the midst of World War One. And some of the ideas that you see on the screen. The first one is just an overhead shot of of the trenches that still scar Europe, that are still there, or some of the memorials. At the very bottom right-hand side, you see a memorial at Verdun, which is one of the bloodiest battles during World War One, and you can see all of the lives that were lost as they have erected crosses there to signify all those that are dead. I wanted to take a look at a couple of ideas. With what we see with Erich Maria Remarque is he was in the war. He's a writer. He was in the war, and then after he comes out of the war, he starts to write about his experiences, and he compiles a book called All Quiet on the Western Front. And mainly it's quiet on the Western Front because there's so much death. But I like this. This is the intro to his book. He says this book is neither an accusation nor a confession. Right, so it's not necessarily pointing any fingers, or it's not necessarily about trying to absolve anyone from anything. He says, and least of all, an adventure. Right, war is, in his mind, is not an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war. And that's really going to be the lasting effect of World War One. That it's that people are going to be traumatized. They're going to call it shell shock in the day, but there's going to be this lasting social trauma, this collective trauma that emerges out of the war that's going to deeply affect the arts. I wanted to take a look at a 19th century poem by Lord Alfred Tennyson called Charge of the Light Brigade. You may have studied this in other classes, and I think it's a good one to juxtapose some of the ideas that we see with World War One. Just want to read through this quickly with you and how he represents, how he portrays war. And I'm going to juxtapose that with a couple other poems that show a different view, the 20th century view of war. He says, and this is a conflict between England and Russia, and what happened in this particular moment is an English officer had made a mistake and caused a lot of death. And so this is a poem to those 600 that died. He says, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. For the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. For the light brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. And so all the soldiers know that someone made a mistake. But here's what the soldiers are supposed to do. Theirs is not to make reply. Theirs is not to reason why. Theirs but to do and die. And so there's this sense of commitment, this sense of blind faith or allegiance to your leaders. And with that should come some type of responsibility that the leaders have towards you, right? But the question that the 20th century is going to ask is, what if your leaders don't have your best interests at heart, right? Continuing on with the poem. Into the valley death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering their gunners there, charged an army well, all the world wondered. Plunged into the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre strokes, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of the 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the Light Brigade. Noble 600. I want you to think about, why does the poem celebrate a defeat, right? What is it about the defeat, right? Normally we celebrate victories, right? But this particular poem that Tennyson writes, he's writing it to someone, to an audience very specific. And so what is it about this, the people and what they did, that's worthy of celebrating, right? And how might this create a sense of nationalism that that World War I is going to start to critique? Some of the ideas that I want you to think about, right, is the ideas that he presents about soldiers and war, is that there's a sense of duty, right? That soldiers are not to reason why, theirs is not to make reply, right? Theirs is but to do and to die, right? So there's that sense of duty and commitment. There's that sense of sacrifice, of being willing to die for a cause greater than your own. And because you're willing to sacrifice that, there is glory and that there is honor, that people will honor you in your death. And so the sense is that even though these 600 have died, right, they are going to be gloried because they are willing to sacrifice for the greater good. I wanted to take a look at a couple other poems. We've read a couple of poems in the previous weeks from Thomas Hardy, and I wanted to take a look at how he represents war. We've already taken a look at a couple of them, but I just wanted to show you a different view of war that we see in the 20th century. Had he and I but met by some ancient inn, we should have sat right down and wet many a napperkin. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so, my foe, of course he was. That's clear enough, although he thought he had enlist, perhaps, offhand, like just as I, was out of work and sold his traps. No other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You'd shoot a fellow down, you'd treat if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. And it's a different tone that we see with Hardy. The idea that glory and honor, right, that there's a sense of purpose within Tennyson's poem, that they're all kind of coming together for the good of the community. But the soldier here doesn't really know why he's there, right? He's just out of work and doesn't really know why he has to shoot this other person. The other person is not some, monstrous enemy that's seeking to destroy. It's a person just like him. But because the nations have created this war, because leaders have wanted this war for their own profit, they put them out there to kill one another. That doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. And so where Tennyson's poem is taking a look more of a bird's eye view of what the soldiers have done and glorying and honoring what the commitment and sacrifice that they've made, what we see with Thomas Hardy is this is more of a microscopic view of war, taking a look at the lives of an individual soldier on the ground and how he feels about killing another person, right? Whether that has purpose to it or not. Taking a look at Drummer Hodge. This one's kind of an interesting one, another view of war here. But again, the soldier here is dead, much like what we see within Charge of the Light Brigade. But there's a different kind of feeling about how we treat the dead. They throw in Drummer Hodge to rest and coffin just as found. His landmark, the Copy Crest, which is just kind of the savanna around him, that breaks the veldt around, and foreign constellations west each night above his mount. And this war here is fighting against an uprising in South Africa. So the English send down some soldiers to put down the uprising, and now Drummer Hodge here has to spend the rest of eternity looking up at the southern constellations when all that he knows are the northern constellations. That's what he grew up with. Young drummer Hodge never knew, fresh from his Wessex home, the meaning of the broad karoo, the bush, the dusty loom, and why uprose to nightly view strange stars amid the gloom. And so he's always wondering why everything looks differently in the southern hemisphere. The answer is you're looking at different stars. Yeah, a proportion of that unknown plain will for Hodge forever be his homely northern breast and brain grow to some southern tree, and strange-eyed constellations reign his stars eternally. And so here is this drummer Hodge who doesn't really have an identity, but he is now going to be forever kind of thrown in to this mass unmarked grave, where he's not really going to be honored. He's not really going to, there's not going to be a parade for his sacrifice and commitment. People just move on. And what we see happening in the 20th century, and 20th century is going to be the bloodiest century in human history as far as nations putting people to death, both their own citizens, whether it's squashing revolutions, uprising, coups, whatever the case may be, or it's wars. We have countless millions of people dying during the 20th century, and part of that is due to a different view of humanity. If you remove spirituality from humanity, and all you have are, animals, flesh and blood. Well, flesh and blood can be replaced, right? So if you're just a living organism, right, one living organism we can throw out onto a battlefield to die, it doesn't necessarily matter, right? If they're have spirits and they're spirit children of a heavenly Father, we start to see people differently, right? But if you start to remove that understanding, then you start to see people just as almost like a machine that you can throw out on the battlefield to create mass casualties. And that's going to be a big part of World War I and a big problem that we're going to consistently confront in the 20th century. And we've taken a look at the channel firing, so I won't go through it too much. But what we see within the channel firing is this idea of people are excitedly embracing war. And part of it is the propaganda of the nations that are promoting this idea of war, getting people excited to go to war. And if you're interested in this, I actually teach an entire course on art and propaganda, and we cover this in more detail. So that's just a kind of a plug for that particular course. I just want to go through a little bit of the propaganda versus the reality. Otto Dix is an artist, a German artist, who was in the war, and he painted or drew, he sketched as he was in the trenches. And the thing about trenches is that there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of time where you're not really fighting. You're just kind of there day in after day and not really having a whole lot to do because you're waiting for the attack. And there has to be strategic moments for those attacks to happen. And so there's a lot of downtime that's then offset by moments of complete and utter chaos. And so as he's feeling that juxtaposition between chaos and just complete boredom, he would sketch kind of some of the thoughts and the images excuse me, that he was having. And this one is the trench suicide. So similar to the ideas of that we see within The Man He Killed, that there really is no glory and honor in war, right? There's a lot of death, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of trauma, but there's not a lot of glory and honor to it. And those that say that there's glory and honor to war are generally profiting from it, right? On the other side, we see the propaganda. We took the hill, come and help us keep it, right? So this idea of this person that's fighting for a cause greater than himself, right? Or as we see here, another Otto Dix image, the wounded soldier who is now dying, but rather than saying, this has meaning and purpose and I'm okay with this, we see the tremendous terror of a person that's confronted with death and not really knowing what's going to happen in the next life. Or juxtaposed with that, with the Red Cross worker, the nurse who's going onto the battlefield to help the soldier who's there, and he's kind of, presented in a more kind of glorious and honorable way. He's just kind of wounded, but he's not screaming out. He's just like, I have this internal strength as she drags him away. Or this one, wounded in a trench, just the mass chaos and people that are just being placed on pikes in order to that kind of litter the trenches, versus this particular image here of the Americans coming in to stop the Germans from crucifying other people. And so kind of an interesting reality versus the propaganda. And what we're going to see is artists who are experiencing the war are going to start to represent the realities more. And the question I want you to think about is, what's better, right? Should we have a more truthful representation, see kind of the horrors of war? Or should we kind of sweep those under the rug and just say, you know what, war, although it's ugly, it's necessary, so let's not focus too much on some of the problems with it. A couple of ideas that I want us to think about, right? The total cost, the hopes, the causes, the warfare, the end of the war, and the social effects. Then we'll end off with the lost generation. Let's start with the causes of the war. In 1914, the perception of the war was romanticized by people, and we see that romanticization in the Channel firing, where we're all kind of roaring their readiness to avenge, right? Trying to, every time they hear a shot, they get to say, "Hey, now is the time that we can go fight," right? And its declaration was met with great enthusiasm. The common view on both sides is it's going to be a short war of maneuver, and then they're going to teach the enemy a lesson, quote unquote, and it would end with a victorious entry into the enemy capital and then home for a victorious parade and then back to normal life, right? Many thought that it was going to be over by Christmas. That they would have that war, and so they thought it was going to be a short war, and they couldn't be more wrong. On the left-hand side, you see the mass casualties, the bodies that were on the field, and then a couple other the propaganda posters. Uncle Sam rears his head during this time. "I want you for the U.S. Army," right? Suggesting that there's this duty, there's this patriotism, and it's all about you. It's on your shoulders, and you need to go out there and do it. Or on the far right-hand side, this is a propaganda poster from Great Britain, and a little daughter is on the father's lap, and she's kind of reading him a story, and she pauses and looks up as she's kind of looking at the illustrations, and she looks to him and says, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" And as he looks at the viewer, he looks at us, we see that his look of consternation, look of kind of anxiety, because he doesn't have a great answer, right? He stayed at home. And so the idea is, do we want to have the same conversation with our future children, that we did not participate in this great campaign of Europe to go off and to fight and to join the cause, or were we left out, right? So this idea is that there's this exciting thing happening, and you don't want to be left out from it, right? The main cause of the war was this arm race in Europe, where nations were competing with each other for military and naval supremacy. France wanted to make sure that its army was more powerful than Austria's, and vice versa. England wanted to be more superior, have a more superior navy than Germany, and vice versa. So each nations were building up arms to defend themselves in the likely event that they were attacked, right? And Thomas Hardy illustrates this beautifully in the Channel firing, where each nation was striving to make the Red War yet redder. The main problem with this, though, is that each side's massive armies were not fighting. As they were building them up, they were just marching them in the streets to parade around. They were going military drills, as we see in the Channel firing, but there was no one to fight, right? So there's a general feeling for the soldiers was, when do we get to fight, right? There's a feeling of inevitability about the war, right? War preparations were being made every day for the war that had not yet begun, and all of this military spending, right? The taxes that were increasing, and people started saying, well, where's the war? And then politicians felt they had to justify this, right? So people grew impatient as they were waiting for the war. And then the other leading cause were the treaties that were made between these nations, right? It became a very complicated web of treaties with these defensive pacts, with the growing expectations of war. Nations began to ally with one another for these defensive reasons. England feared that Germany would ally with Austria and thereby defeat them in war, so England allied with France for France's support in the event that Germany and Austria declared war on England. The result of this was that if the two nations were in war, due to the pacts and treaties, all nations were going to become involved with the war. And so it was no longer like the 19th century, just England going against Russia or something like that. It was going to now that they had all of these intricate webs, it was going to pull everybody. And all it just had to happen was that two nations had to declare war on each other, and then everyone is going to be pulled into it. And so Europe was sitting on top of a powder keg waiting for a spark to ignite. And that spark came with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. When visiting Bosnia, a region controlled by Austria, Ferdinand and his wife were shot in a motorcade by a Serbian who wanted independence from Austria. Austria declared war on Serbia due to a treaty with England. England declared war on Austria due to its treaty Austria had with Germany. Germany then declared war on England. This caused Russia and France to declare war on Germany and Austria, and the rest, as they say, is history, right? And so this kind of bringing this all in. A couple other ideas just to note about the war and its mass, its totality. The idea of a total war, the idea that everyone was not only involved with the war, right? So men, women, and children were brought into the war. The men were shipped off to be soldiers. At least the young men were shipped off to be soldiers. The old men were recruited to be in the factories. The women and the children were all kind of part of this ongoing effort. So in that sense, it became a total war where everyone's life was affected. But in addition to this idea of the total war, that civilians also became targets, which was something quite new. It used to be, in the old days, right, of war, you would just fight, militaries would fight against militaries, right? Combatants, if you had a gun, you would fight against someone with another gun. During World War I, they started seeing civilian areas as military targets. And so heavily populated cities that we saw with the rise of urbanization in the 19th century, they became military targets. Factories became military targets. Apartment complexes became military targets. And all of this is going to increase the mass of deaths, right? Another main problem that we see with World War I is the trench warfare. Advances in military technology meant that defensive firepower outweighed offensive capabilities, making the war particularly murderous as tactics had failed to keep up. Barbed wire was a significant hindrance to massive infantry advances. Artillery, now vastly more lethal than in the 19th century, coupled with machine guns, made crossing open grounds a nightmarish prospect. And in fact, the area in between the two sides of the trenches, so each side would dig in trenches where they would act as fortifications. And then the land in between was filled with barbed wire and landmines to make sure that the other side wouldn't have a harder time advancing. And so that area in between them became known as no man's land, because this was a land where no man would survive. And in fact, whenever a officer would get bored and want to advance and to advance the troops, as soon as the men raised their head above the trench, they became an easy target for the people on the other side with their machine guns to mow them down pretty quickly. And so what you have is a 4-year stalemate. And so you had some advances on either side. You had sometimes the British would advance, sometimes the Germans would advance, and vice versa. But essentially, there was no major gains on either side for 4 entire years. And so what you have is just simply a stalemate. And you have massive casualties as a result. They're trying to advance. It's not like they're just sitting in their trenches not doing anything. They're trying to advance, but they can't because it's just too hard. And so you just have the death count just keeps piling up. And another part of the trench warfare was kind of interesting about this is for the first time, England, for instance, would have different trenches. They'd have the front lines, and then they'd have a reserve, and then behind that they'd have another reserve and then another reserve. And so each soldier would spend a week in the reserve as they worked their way up to the line, and then they'd spend a week on the front line, and then if they were still alive, they would send them home to England for a week to recover, and then they would send them back to the back end of the line, and then they'd work up. And so there's this constant cycle. And what that does is it makes the war seem more alive. They have first-hand accounts of people that were experiencing the war going home, right? So they could be in the trench in the morning and they could be home in London by evening eating dinner at a cafe, telling stories about what the war is actually like. And so these gory, horrific stories start to affect people, and they start to say, maybe, what's the whole point of all of this kind of bloodshed? And then you'd also have all of these massive explosions where people would hear the war. And so the war was omnipresent. Whether you're fighting in the trenches or whether you're back home, you felt the war one way or another. And so the technology kept getting better and better, right? The advances, but what that means is that death counts get better and better, right? In the old days, when you have to, have your bullet, and then you have to add the gunpowder, and then you'd have to kind of, put it all in. You can only fire maybe a round or two a minute. But with a machine gun, you can fire hundreds of rounds in a couple of seconds. And so it makes death a lot more convenient and a lot easier. And the other one, where U-boats or submarines was also part of this technology that's advancing, to being able to sneak in behind enemy lines and be able to destroy the enemy at home, again raising the death count of civilians at home. And the major one that was implemented during this time was the use of chemical warfare. The idea of mustard gas was being used, and they would throw the mustard gas inside the trench, and then you would have the chemical agent go off, and it would kill massive amount of people. So very efficient, very quick way of killing a lot of people. And so you have this is another Otto Dix sketch here of people that are wearing gas masks to protect themselves in the event of chemical warfare from the onslaught of people coming in. And the chemical warfare, as they find out, as the historians come back and they take a look at it, it wasn't actually as used as widely as we generally tend to think it was. But the main thing of chemical warfare was the psychological toll, the fear that the other side was going to use that. And so it left a tremendous impact on the psyche of people. The end of the war, just kind of taking a look at the end of the war quickly here. The United States really didn't get into the war until about 1917. And then there was an armistice on November 11th, 1918, which we just recently celebrated, right? Armistice Day, November 11th, last week. What we see with these, with the armistice, well, first of all, the United States wasn't in there very long. Right? They were only in there for less than a year. But what happens with the armistice is that both sides just decide to stop fighting. And they were just kind of sick of it. The soldiers were sick of it. Russia already left the war. Their soldiers already decided to form a coup back home with the Russian Revolution, which is a story for another day. But then both sides just start to get sick of the war, and they decide to stop. But the Treaty of Versailles, it took them about a year. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't signed until 1919, and so it took them about a year to actually work out the finer points of it. But the problem with the end of the war is that it just ended swiftly. There was no major advances on either side, and you can see that they're signing this document inside the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. We've talked about that before, but all of these dignitaries come in from all the nations. You can see Woodrow Wilson over here. All of these dignitaries come in to sign this pact, this treaty that says we're going to end the war, which in a way, yes, it's great. We're all celebrating, but the problem with it is that it ended so quickly that both sides started wondering, if I just stayed in the war a little bit longer, maybe a few more months, maybe the tide of the war would have changed. Maybe I would have got that extra land that I wanted. Maybe I could have been victorious. Maybe the war would have had greater meaning and significance. And so you have this sense of unsettled debts as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Another problem with the Treaty of Versailles is they're going to punish, you're going to see this on the bottom right-hand side, they're going to punish the German people to an extent that the German people are going to come back in the 30s and start to reject every single one of the punishments that the Treaty of Versailles enacted on Germany. So in some ways, the Treaty of Versailles indirectly, in some ways directly, causes World War II. And so, but in some ways it was celebrated, right? The end of the war, it's all great, wonderful. But again, there's this sense that because there was no major victories, what's it all mean? Right? Why did we even do it? And so there's this sense of, as they started, taking a look at the tallies, right, of 8.5 to 15 million deaths in battle. And they don't necessarily know the exact number because most people were buried in mass graves. So the estimate is between 8.5, that's on the conservative end, to 15 million soldiers died in battle, and about 8 to 9 million died at home. And so conservative estimates suggest that about 20 million people died as a result of World War I. And so then the question is, what's the point of it, right? What did we gain from any of this? And so there's this large element of national collective trauma as a result of the war. It feels as though it had no purpose, it had no meaning. Why did I send my sons? Why did I send my husband? Why did I send my brother? Whatever the case may be. Why did I send these people to die for a war that had no meaning, right? So this idea of Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, we all did it. Even though we died, there was a meaning and purpose to it. What we see in World War I was, what if it doesn't have meaning, right? What's the whole point of it all then? And so we get the sense that there's this futility of war. And so you have this massive rise of anarchy, the lack of trust in politicians and political leaders, that they're not really looking out for our best interests, even though we live in a democracy. And in the 19th century, we had this great faith that eventually we're going to have this perfect regime, that we're leading towards something better, or with Darwin suggests that we're evolving to become something better, or Karl Marx says that politically we'll end up in some place better, right? Or Nietzsche suggests that we're going to eventually find an Übermensch who's going to lead us to a better ideal. That optimism here feels as though it's for naught. It feels as though people are wondering why it all happened. And so you see massive anarchy and massive pacifism, people that don't want anything to do with violence. And in fact, that idea of pacifism still remains to this day in Europe. If you go to Europe, they are much more offended by violence than they are other things. In the United States, we're much more offended by things of sensuality or whatnot. In Europe, that doesn't really affect them. What affects them is violence, and it starts here, right? This is still in Europe considered the Great War, right? The war to end all wars, and it leaves a lasting effect on the minds and hearts of people for years to come. Families were altered by the departing men with the death and absence of the primary wage earner. Women were forced into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. And at the same time, industry needed to replace the lost laborers that were sent. And so this aided the struggle for women, for voting rights and whatnot. And so in some ways, there are these positive elements to it in addition to all this kind of collective national trauma. But as another element that changes as a result of this is the direct consequence of World War I brought an end to many of the old regimes that would lead to 300 years of European hegemony. And so this dominance of Europe. No other war changed the map of Europe so dramatically, and you see that map on the far right-hand side. 4 empires were shattered as a result of the war. The German Empire was over, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was over, the Ottoman Empire was over, the Russian Empire was over. The 4 dynasties, the Hohenzollerners, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, who had roots and powers back to the days of the Middle Ages and the Crusades, all fell apart during World War I. And the experiences I mentioned led to this idea of, this collective trauma, right? This, philosophically speaking, the war seemed to prove to many that the philosophies of the 19th century were true, right? That humanity isn't necessarily this inherently good being, that we have this inherently destructive element. And this is where the lost generation comes in. What we see with the Lost Generation is a group of artists, writers, and thinkers that emerged from the war. Having experienced the war in some way, these people felt lost by the war's devastating effects. The term Lost Generation refers to an alienation of young men and women who lived through and sometimes witnessed the war firsthand. And it was coined by Gertrude Stein, who is a writer, a poet. She was American, and then she goes and lives in Paris. That referred to the group of American literary notables who lived in Paris during the 1920s and 30s. Significant members included Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sherwood Anderson, Waldo Pierce, Sylvia Beach, Gertrude Stein herself. And then the epigraph of the novel, The Sun Also Rises, which we'll read this semester, Stein says that you are all a lost generation, lamenting the war and what the war had done to the country's youth, right? This kind of melancholic mood, this sense that they're all adrift. And you see an image of Hemingway as he's preparing to go to the war. He wanted to enlist in the war, but he had a heart condition. So he enlists in the Red Cross to go and see it firsthand. And as he's going, he's excited. He has full of hopes and ambition. He has this kind of mindset of Tennyson that this is going to be the great adventure of his life. And as he goes to the war, he sees that there's nothing glorious and honorable about it. He's actually going to be injured in the war, and he's going to turn and he's going to write about it. And this is going to leave a lasting effect on him throughout his life. And so The Sun Also Rises is a book about the characters who are living in the aftermath of war, trying to piece their shattered lives together. And so this is the World War I is a major transformative event that shapes the way that people see the world, and it shapes the way that people represent it through art.